Hello, welcome back to another video. My name is Gemma and today I'm going to be talking about the New York Times best books of the 21st century. So, I'm not reacting to the list. That has been done. It has been very, very done. So if you want to see some reactions, I would very much recommend that you go and check out Kieran and Katie Books video. I'll link it below, and also Shelley Swearingen's video, which I will link below. But when I saw the list, I was somewhat bemused. I feel like the people who curated that list had a very very narrow approach to what merits a best book. And there were several issues that I had with it. Firstly, why on earth were there several authors listed multiple times? Jesmond Ward, who I very much like, on there 3 times. She doesn't need to be there 3 times. Just put her on once, it's fine. And Eleanor Ferrante, I think she was on 3 times. And I don't like her, so I really didn't want her to be on 3 times. And several other authors were on twice. I think Hilary Mantel was on there twice. 2 books in the same series. Same for Eleanor Ferrante. It's like, I think you need to broaden your horizons somewhat. Another issue that I had was the lack of genre fiction. There was some genre fiction on there, and by that I mean fantasy, sci-fi, horror, romance, anything that isn't literary fiction, basically. I think Kieran put it quite well, and it was just a lot of prize-winning books smushed onto a 100-book list. And then my other... 2 more issues. One was lack of demographic diversity. So they were all adult books. There was no young adult, no children's books on there. And I'm sorry, but there have been some amazing children's books and YA novels released in this century. So why on earth were none of them included? What, because it can only be a good book if it's written for an adult audience? What a load of absolute bollocks. And I don't think there was a single translated book on the list either, because obviously good books, apparently according to the New York Times, can only be written in English. So with those issues in mind, I decided that I would suggest 15 books to the New York Times list curators, both, and so I have 15 books here for you that I think should have made that list and didn't. And maybe they could replace some of the book authors that are on there multiple times, or some of the books that quite frankly just don't deserve to be there. Right. Let me consult my notebook. So the first book I'm going to mention is a super new release. Well, not super new. I didn't include anything from 2024 because I thought, maybe the judges didn't include anything from this year because they're not like up to the minute, maybe. But really they should be if they're writing a list about books from this century. Anyway, I didn't include anything from 2024, but I do have something from 2023, and that is Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. This is a dystopian, sci-fi, awesome look at the prison system and race and disability and minorities within the prison system, and what that would look like in a Hunger Games come Gladiator style world, and it blew my mind. And I think it should have been on the list, but it wasn't. I do have a solo review for that one. I'll leave it linked below. Looking at YA, I am someone who really doesn't gel with a lot of YA novels. It's not really my jam. However, as my good friend Jack at Spread Book Joy always tells me, there are YA books and there are just good books that happen to be categorised as YA. And so fitting very well into that category is Naughts and Crosses by Malorie Blackman. And this was a huge deal when it came out. Malorie Blackman in this book is reversing racism, so that the dominant race in the UK where this book is set is black, and the minority race are white. And so we see this situation flipped around, and we have an almost sort of Romeo Juliet style love trope where we have a black girl and a white boy who sort of fall in love when they're very, very young. His mother works for her mother. And then as they grow to be teenagers, they start to realise that maybe that's just not going to be feasible. But it was dark. It got really dark. And I thought it was so well done. And I know I read a few articles about it, about the time when it was released. And it really did blow up because it flipped white privilege. And it made white people see actually how different things are for black people. And so yeah, why the hell is that book not on the list? It was amazing. I also have a solo review for that linked below. Next, graphic novel. So there were a couple of graphic novels included on the list, so well done, New York Times. At least you had some diversity in your list. However, the one that I would have liked to see on there, in addition to Persepolis, 'cause Persepolis is very good, is Saga by Brian K. Vaughn, illustrated by Fiona Staples. Saga is an epic sci-fi masterpiece. It's so beautifully illustrated. It's so fun to read. It keeps you engaged all the way through. And Volume 1 was released in 2012. So it fits nicely into this time period that we are talking about. And I think everyone should read it. And I think it is fabulous and one of the best books of this century. So that should be on the list. Next, a very, very recent one that a lot of people have read this year, but struck a chord with me in a way that no book has in the history of the world. That is Soldier Sailor by Claire Kilroy. And this one looks at a mother who is struggling postpartum to look after her child. Her husband isn't as helpful as perhaps she thought he might be, and she is learning what it is to basically not be in control of your own life anymore, and probably never will be again. And it is so true to reality. It's one of those books that made me feel so seen and so validated in my feelings, particularly those like first 2 years after you've had a child, where basically you feel like you're doing everything wrong, nothing's going right, you're the worst parent in the history of the world. And yeah, and I think that was my experience of the book, but I do know that people who aren't mothers have had really positive experiences with it as well, particularly people who like to see things from other viewpoints other than their own, which is usually my happy place, right? I don't actually often like to read about my own viewpoint, but this one did an excellent job, and that was released in 2023, so that should have been on the list. One that like everybody talks of, and it's on so many like best books lists. I'm really surprised that it was missed off of this one, and that's The Kite Runner by Khaled, which was published in 2003. And this follows a young boy growing up in Afghanistan when the war sort of happens, and he has a friend who is of a different caste to him, but they grow up very much friends, and we see their relationship develop. And then similar to Naughts and Crossers, as they come into adolescence, we start to see this divide as sort of the socio-economic environment sort of presses in upon them. But it's told from the perspective of one of the boys as an adult, and so we sort of flip back and things are revealed about what happens in that very difficult time when the war is starting to break out between these two boys, and then what happens afterwards as he sort of tries to fix the mistakes of his past. And it's so good. It's so good. Like, everybody loves that book. Why is that not on the list? Next up, I'm going to go for a historical gothic book, which is an ode to the Brontes. Also a firm favourite of lots of people, The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield. This one is brilliant, following a writer who is writing the biography of a very secretive author who has written many books over the years and is now sort of reaching the end of her life. She thinks she's dying, and she wants to tell her story to this girl. And it's sort of, so we flip between current timeline and the past timeline. And it's so twisty, so turny, so gothic, so atmospheric. Everybody should read that book. And yet, it's not on the list. Switching now to an Australian author. I'm not sure if there were any Australian authors on the list. Probably not, because it's the New York Times, so it's probably only British and American authors. The White Girl by Tony Birch. And this was a new find for me last year, though it was published in 2019. Tony Birch is an Aboriginal Australian author, and I am so excited to read the rest of his work after reading that book last year. It follows a granddaughter and her grandmother. The granddaughter sort of passes as white because she has a white parent, white father, and it's about how the Australian state almost tries to separate them because they want to sort of keep tabs on all the Aboriginal people and settlements, and yeah, it's bizarre, but it's reality. It was reality in Australia in the 70s, I think, when it was set, but it just sort of blows your mind that was happening so recently. But the relationship between the grandmother and the granddaughter was so heartwarming, and you just love the characters. There are characters that you hate also, but this feeling of family and community and connectedness, very few books are able to produce that and also give you this sort of historical period in time that perhaps isn't very widely written about. And so that should be the kind of topic that you want to read from a list like this. Not there. Switching now to a translated book, because there should be translated books on there, and my favourite translated book of all time is Tender is the Flesh by Agustina and Bazterrica. This was published in 2017. Bazterrica is a South American author. She writes in Spanish, and this follows the assistant manager of a human abattoir in a world where meat is no longer edible, so they rear and kill and eat humans. And it's dark, clearly brutal. There are a lot of moments where it blows your mind, and the ending, yeah, I didn't see it coming, but it came. And yeah, I highly recommend to everybody, unless you're squeamish, then probably not, and I wouldn't recommend eating a bacon sandwich whilst reading that book. Then the next book on my list is The Mountains Sing by Nguyen, Phan, Kime. This was published in 2020 and looks at Vietnam over multiple generations, but broadly told by the sort of grandmother figure of the story. But it looks at several atrocities that have happened over the lifespan of one person, including the Vietnam War and Japanese occupation and all sorts of horrific stuff, the Civil War. And it was stunning and heartbreaking in equal measure. I think Vietnamese history is something that I'm not very well versed on, and it has such a traumatic but also such a rich history that I could just inhale Vietnamese literature because it's so interesting, such an interesting country, and the sense of family, similar to the Tony Birch, but the sense of family that you get from that novel is just delicious. It's right up my alley, and it should be on the list. So this one was nominated for a prize, as was Soldier Sailor. There are a couple of women's prize books on here. I think this is actually the only other one, and that's I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel. And this wasn't a 5-star read for me, but this is such a good book, and it looks at a woman and her obsession with a man through social media and the man's girlfriend. And it's quite trippy in the way that it's told, but it's really interesting examination of the social media age and what that looks like. And yeah, it's such a short book, that I just feel like you should go into it as blind as possible. It's really short and snappy, but it packs such a punch, like right to the facial area. And yeah, I think that should get more praise. I feel like it got quite a lot of praise over the Women's Prize season, but then not so many people have talked about it since. But I think that's a really impactful book. Looking at genre fiction, I have another sci-fi, because I did mention Saga. Oh, and Chain Gang All Stars. I do have a soft spot for well-written sci-fi. But I could not include The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. This is a feel-good, comfy, cosy sci-fi following a crew on a ship, the Wayfarer, and really just their interactions with each other. But what is really interesting is the way that Chambers looks at communities and the way that people interact with each other, and then she puts it into this world that she has created, and she creates these ideas that are really interesting and really different, and look at maybe how we can human differently, I suppose. And it was just great. It was fun to read, the characters were lovable, really interesting ideas that make you think, and all packaged up in a lovely little spaceship. What more could you want? Then I have a non-fiction, Know My Name by Chanel Miller. I mean, this is a cult classic at this point. I think pretty much everyone's read it. Why isn't it on the list? This follows Chanel Miller, who was sexually assaulted on a university campus, and she tells the story of not so much the assault, though that does play a part, but the aftermath of that and what it means to accuse someone of sexual assault and to try and get justice for that, and how difficult it is, particularly in the American penal system, but it's the same story the world over, right? And she was so brave, so courageous in telling this story, but also she wrote it herself, and it was fabulously written. It was so well written. And yeah, I just think it's one of those books that is so important. The topic is so important in today's age, and it's well written, so it's like a win-win book for a book for a list like this. So I don't understand why that wasn't there. Looking at some Indigenous fiction from the US, obviously we had Tony Birch for Australia, but for the US I would pick, or for Northern America, sorry, Canada, I would pick Five Little Indians by Michelle Good, which looks at 5 characters who experienced Indian residential schools and how that impacted their lives. And for some of them it impacted it very, very negatively. Some of them managed to come through, and so we look at the different impacts that period of time in Canada had on different people, and it was just fantastically written, and one of those books that you just can't put down. Again, important subject area, well written book. I think this one did receive some prize attention as well, but I would have liked to see that on there. That was published in 2020. Go back to 2009 now, and I have another translated book, and that is Cain by Jose Saramago. I forgot to write the translator down. It will be in the description box. But Jose Saramago is a Portuguese author. He is very well known for his book Blindness, which I haven't read, so I'm only recommending books for this list that I have read. But Cain is looking at the story of Cain and Abel with a very sarcastic eye. And we follow Cain's life as imagined by Saramago. And it picks a lot of holes in the Bible, so if that's not your jam, then maybe don't read that book. But it made me laugh so much, and it was just a really interesting examination of that chapter of the Bible. I have never read the Bible, so I don't know what it actually says, but it was an interesting retelling nonetheless. And religion is important in our world, so maybe something touching on religion would be useful in the list. The last book I would have liked to see on the list is a children's book, and that is Melissa by Alex Gino. And this looks at a young girl who's growing up in a male body called George, and we see George transition into Melissa throughout the course of the book, what that looks like at school, what that looks like at home, and what that looks like for her friends. And I just thought it was beautifully simple but heartwarming and informative and just full of love. and understanding, and yeah, you don't see many books by trans authors covering trans topics for children, and it needs to be done very delicately, right? And Gino absolutely did that in this book, and yeah, I would have liked to see that also on the list. Alas, none of my 15 were on that list. There were some very good books on there, don't get me wrong. I think I had read... How many? Oh, I think I wrote it down. How many had I read? I read 17 in DNF 2. I can't remember which two I DNF now. Oh, The Sympathiser and one other. I can't remember. But yeah, what a rubbish list. I would say if you want to put your 2 pence worth in, Shelley... the aforementioned Shelley Swearingen is compiling a list of what BookTube thinks are the best books of the 21st century. So if you want to throw some books into the list, head over to her channel. She's got a like a Google form that you can fill in and put some books in there, and then I guess she'll collate them and tell us what the results are when she has them. So, so yeah, I'd love to know what books do you think should have been included, and whether you disagree with any of my additions. And I will see you all very soon with another one. Bye, guys.